This is Greg Shrnirring, and welcome to the third chapter in the Track Media interview series with Ted Kichels. So far, we've covered Ted's years at KBDI TV in Colorado, a small independent public television station, and his years at WPSU TV and FM at Penn State, large university station. Today, we're going to talk about Ted's years at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in Washington, D.C., CPB, which will also cover the time that Ted and I worked together at CPB. So, Ted, I think the place to start is to talk about CPB in relationship to what it does and its place in public media.
Well, I should say, first of all, that I had worked with CPB on different task forces and projects over the years. So I think I thought I understood it. And I certainly liked working with some of the individuals there, maybe some more than others, but overall, I kind of had a sense of it. Coming into it on a daily basis was somewhat of a culture shock, not dissimilar from going from KBDI to Penn State, but it's just a very different culture. And I struggled a little bit to kind of get my feet on the ground around that. I think the important thing to remember is that CPB is a government-created agency. I mean, it's a 501c3, technically separate, but its board is basically appointed by the President of the United States. These are folks who come up through different senatorial offices, typically. Some are folks who wanted to be an ambassador, but they ended up on the CPB board. And so that was the group that basically governed and hired the president and of CPB, very different than you would have with individual licensees, with PBS, with apps, with NPR, where you have a very strong, management, station management component on the board, and you have very different directives. So I think understanding why CPB was so focused on its board governance and why its number one priority was to secure and maintain or increase the federal funding is really important because it is very different than the other entities in public media. And I knew that intellectually, but I think I did not know the amount of time that CPB would focus on its relationships with the Congress on the Hill, with managing a board that often came in with limited knowledge of how public broadcasting worked, and had very different personalities that just took a while. As you know, Greg, some were eccentric in different ways. So I think getting that and understand that that's what drove CPB primarily. And then we had our role, on I guess we would call system development, media strategies, on the TV side, but then there was a radio component as well. Is that our goal was basically to take care of the stations, to relate to the stations, and then to kind of come up with the programs and whatnot, oversee things like interconnection, CSG, things that came out of the blue like Spectrum. And how those two meshed together, I would say, was not always easy. But that was part of the challenge of being at CPB.
I think I certainly understand that. I look at it in this kind of sense, and that is that there were basically three groups of people that worked at CPB. You had Pat, Michael, Helen Savage, and so forth, who had come from government. They'd come from the State Department. Then you had the folks like you and me, Vinny, and others, Kathy Merritt, who came from stations. And then there was a third group, and that was made up of the people that were from DC that didn't have experience in government and didn't have experience in public media, but were really smart people. And I looked at the kind of combination of those three groups of people coming together to really do a nice job in relationship to supporting public media across the country. Sometimes we had to, we used different language and had to kind of explain ourselves. But I think together, those three groups of people, led by Pat Harris and longtime CEO, president and CEO of CPB, really, really work together well.
Well, we might get into that more as we go through this. I don't think it was quite as well oiled, maybe as you think. I agree, very smart people, and I think our department uh, was actually one of the best groups of people I've worked with. Um, just really smart in a lot of different ways, worked together incredibly well. So I very much appreciate that. And I appreciate the larger point you're making that CPB did function. Uh,
Yes.
Sometimes it was a little creaky, it wasn't always easy, but we did keep it moving.
Well, we did. CPB's mission is to ensure universal access to non-commercial high-quality content, and it does so by distributing 70% of its funding to more than 1,500 locally owned public radio and public television stations. And I think CPB has met that mission quite well over the course of time. And I was there for 15 years, and you were there for a lot of years as well. So Ted, after you left Penn State, you spent most of a year working at PBS on a project called Public Media Models of the Future, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But you had the unique experience of working at an independent, relatively small public television station, a large university system, also at PBS and CPB. So you saw it not only from both sides, but you saw it from all sides.
That's one way of putting it. Yeah, I did. And I don't know how much of it was accidental or how much was just my tendency to get involved in extracurricular activities, but I got involved as well in the affinity group coalition, where I ended up chairing at different times the university licensees and the joint licensees, and then chairing the whole organization. And AGC was not a strong organization overall. It didn't have staffing, it didn't have funding. But by doing that, you get exposed to what are the issues around the system people are worried about or what's affecting people. So I think that part, I think that was also true with the models of the future. It was intentionally looking with some depth at stations that seem to have things figured out. And we'll talk more about that later, and just trying to pull that together and think through what are the elements that make a station successful. So yes, I did, whether it was intentional or just being on the ride, uh, go through a lot of different experiences.
So let's talk about the projects that you worked on at CPB. And let me start with TV interconnection. It's something that you spent a lot of time on. And so would you talk about CPB's role in funding TV interconnection and just the whole interconnection enterprise in general?
Okay. Well, interconnection never goes away. I learned that fairly early on at CPB, and it was probably one of the first mega projects that I had to oversee. I don't know if everyone understands, but the funding for interconnection comes through Congress. It's a separate appropriation. It is not a given that it has to go to PBS, but traditionally, historically, that's the way it has gone. But CPB has it in its mind, and I think justifiably so, a role in ensuring that and reviewing how that work is going. So that came under my department, and we would hire a consultant because CPB did not have, and I certainly did not have, the kind of technology expertise to do that review on my own, nor did anybody else at CPB. So we brought in, on the first one that I oversaw, John Footen, was hired. He's one of my favorite consultants, a very smart guy. And this is at a time when things were starting to change. And we were starting to look at, is satellite delivery the way to do it? What about where most of the programs are actually not live, the NRT, we would call them? Is there a better way? Terrestrial was starting to come up. So this was the early days, but John Footen was somewhat ahead of the time. So he did a very ambitious report. It tied into a lot of politics, and the politics around interconnection are very substantial on both the radio and TV side, although different. So you had GBH at that time with PMM that it was trying to get off the ground, very focused on terrestrial delivery of content. You had PBS, which was, I think somewhat entrenched in the way it had always done things and somewhat wary of changing anything. And then the stations who frankly didn't pay a lot of attention. They got their interconnection, they got their little stipend, they paid whatever that was, and they just were generally just had faith that everything would work out. So John Futen's report basically shook it up. He said that you should be looking more at the cost here, some of the hidden cost and the management part. You should be definitely looking at transitioning off the satellite more quickly. So all of this on one level made sense, but the pot it stirred was one that I had not been exposed to quite that way. And that was the kind of underlying tensions between PBS and CPB, as well as NPR and PBS and CPB. So essentially, here's CPB, kind of bureaucratic organization, starting to suggest to PBS, this whole engineering department, that maybe they ought to be looking at things differently. And so there was a lot of pushback. And I remember particularly, it was a GM strategy meeting, Greg. I don't know if you were there,
I
but I
was.
was facilitating this meeting, and I've never felt so helpless as a facilitator in my life. I think it had been somewhat wired. I think I understand why, but PBS had kind of gotten people, both riled up and willing to speak at this meeting. John Footen, a great guy, not the best person to put on the spot. So he was up there as the expert on all this. I was facilitating, and these questions were coming from all over the place, and they were mostly very critical. How could you do this? How could you second guess? How could you, this is not going to work. This isn't good. And John kind of melted. I mean, he was not a wonderful person, but not somebody who took that kind of pressure well. So he was trying to accommodate everybody. I was trying to facilitate and not take a stand. And everybody else just sat on their thumbs. So I was expecting this may be where one of those times I missed Vinny, because Vinny would have stood up and gone on a little tirade, but we didn't have anybody there. So this was my introduction to the world of CPB and politics on a national scale. It ended up, I would say, working pretty well. That actually PBS ended up using John Footen a lot as they started to implement the plan. So we got through it and I think developed a very good working relationship with the PBS engineering folks over the years. But it certainly got off to a rough start.
Well, it did, but I think this is one example of how seriously CPB took its role in relationship to doing due diligence before providing a grant.
Well, more seriously, I think, than some of the other national organizations thought it should. I think NPR probably is more in that category where they just did not want and seemed to actively resist CPB's looking into any kind of depth into its operations. And so that was a much more of a difficult. It was kind of like just trying to extract any information that they would unwillingly provide. But yes, I think that is the role that CPB plays, and it should play, frankly.
So, Ted, another major topic that you dealt with during your years at CPB was spectrum. Would you take us through what that's all about?
Oh God, I'll put myself to sleep. But these issues, and this is another one, they're like critically important issues. They're not issues that the system as a whole is paying a lot of attention to. At this point, this was like a year out from the auction, I think. And we had to get, our arms around what this was. You had the potential of stations, public stations around the country, basically selling their license. And it could have been devastating to the overall fabric of public television. So there was all of this concern about what is that? What is it? And how disruptive is it going to be? What should stations know? So this was another one that ended up in our lap in my department. And we brought in a very good guy, Dennis Wallace from MSW, and just a really down to earth guy. And we started like talking to different folks around, both in the commercial industry and just around scenarios and trying to understand better what was going to happen. But this again, like the interconnection, we're kind of on the forefront, not by choice, but if you look at what's evolved since then, was the disaggregation of media and the downgrading, frankly, of broadcast technology. This is where a lot of this stuff was percolating, and our goal at that time was to try to get ahead of that. I don't know whether I can say how much we succeeded or not, but that was kind of what we were trying to do because it also affected, and we'll talk about this later, is our CSG policy. So with Spectrum, one of the things that came up fairly soon as we were deliberating is what is a station? You know, it's been typically defined without any real pushback as you've got a transmitter, you've got an FCC license, you're broadcasting, and that kind of morphed into you might be broadcasting more than one channel now at this point, and then it morphs into you might not actually need all or even a majority of your spectrum to deliver a broadcast signal. But then you have a CSG program that is based on that being a broadcaster in that particular market. So at what point are you not a broadcaster? At what point does it affect your CSG? So this is like that kind of policy wonk stuff that we just had to wrestle with on a number of different fronts. And the spectrum, I think, was really pushing us in a way more than the others to really try to think about this in advance and what are the potential repercussions.
Ahead of the spectrum incentive auction, you had policy in place.
We did, and we were flying blind a little bit. And we very arbitrarily, I think, in the CSG review, basically said you have to retain control of 50% of your spectrum. To be honest, I don't think it was really thought out what that meant, what the capacity of 50%. It seemed like it was enough spectrum to deliver a quality broadcast signal, but it was not a precise measurement. But we had to have some stake in the ground saying if you want to continue to get your CSG, you have to maintain that control.
So, Ted, we talked about all of the preparation that went into getting ready for the auction, where the FCC wanted to try to reclaim some spectrum. So we were prepared, and then the auction happened. Take the story from there.
Well, I guess on one level it was kind of like Y2K, it happened, but it wasn't quite as catastrophic as people thought. So you had, it was surprises in terms of where the money went, but it wasn't as if it was a major readjustment for public media. I think that was, what we had feared most was it would essentially cannibalize the whole system. That did not happen. I think you had some extremes. You had, I think, YBE in Philadelphia that completely sold out. And actually, it made sense for them why they did that. You had other stations that kind of figured out a way to do it, but it was not as big a deal. I think a lot of the focus became for CPB and for our department was the repacking that would happen, because that became a significant issue. Stations that had to move to a different frequency for all of this to happen, regardless of whether they were part of the auction. So we put a lot of time into that. Dennis Wallace was available individually for stations, or collectively. We had some different group meetings, and basically moved from there. We reconvened the CSG panel to sort of, I think, validate that the 50% still made sense. And we moved on with that. So I would say there were the individual issues in the markets, mostly around the repacking. And I'm not aware, and maybe my memory is failing me, I'm not aware of any particular meltdown that occurred.
There were some other big amounts that stations received, or their licensees received, but generally speaking, it left the system intact.
Yes, I think that was a good news. This one little irrelevant detail, YBE was actually happened because of John Swartz, who founded KBDI. He had the frequency that he had kind of figured out all these different ways and worked with ITFSC, you might remember a lot. But he essentially donated that frequency to the YBE board, or the founders, or I forget the actual name of the entity. So there is a link there, and it certainly came back to help whoever was involved with WYBE at the time. But that was Spectrum, and it began again, one of those ones like interconnection, it never goes away. It was like we were there before the auction, we were there after the auction, and I assume there's still hopefully people thinking about this.
Let's transition to talking about the community service grant, and we'll pick up where you left off in just a minute or so. But a little bit of background for people regarding the CSG, Community Service Grant, which goes to all CPB qualified TV and radio stations. There's a lot of policy that surrounds this formula-driven program. But in essence, for both television and radio, the main factor regarding the size of a station's grant is how much non-federal financial support, or NFFS, a station can raise. Bottom line, the more you raise, the larger your grant will be. And that goes back to a time when all of the stations really needed an incentive to raise money because nobody was really raising much. So that's where NFFS kind of started as the base component. Now, that's overly simplistic because of CSG policy. So, Ted, pick up the story from there regarding the CSG reviews.
Let me continue a little bit on your line, because a lot of the CSG, the Community Service Grant, is like statutory, and there is a formula base, some of which is CPB discretion. But it is 75% of that money goes to TV, 25% goes to radio, which, being on the radio side, has, I think, been a historic source of tension, or a source of feeling like, see, radio has been cheated. But that was kind of something that never has been seriously revisited, I don't think, probably for good reason. But then within that, there is a portion. You have a base grant, which was what on the TV side, about 500,000.
Yeah, in that vicinity.
In that vicinity. And then to your point, the rest is NFFS. So if you're a small station with, like a $2 million or under budget, or 5 million even and under, that base grant is your core funding, because your ability to raise money in a less populated area is limited. If you're a larger station, that base grant is kind of chump change, and you're really raising, your grant is really coming more heavily from all the money you're able to raise from a larger population, membership, underwriting, all of that goes into that pot. So you have this tremendous inequity between stations on the higher end that in that 50 to 100, I think even 200 million, one case, and then the smaller stations that are, basically just scratching for the rest of it. So it's a policy that is somewhat arbitrary if you look at it. And on the one hand, you could say, well, larger stations have more needs. They're serving larger populations. Smaller stations, who cares? But then on the other hand, you say, well, universal service, and is it equitable to have these stations struggling at the lower end? So these are kind of the key things that would keep coming up in CSG reviews. I think the spectrum, to your point, was kind of, as I think I talked about a little bit earlier, is we have to anticipate this and we have to look at how it could impact the grants. So I would say the big thing, we did what, like 2.5 CSG reviews? It seemed like
Yeah, they started, it was kind of almost continuous from 2014 on, to at least the time I retired, which was 2019.
yeah. And I would say the issues, one of the regular issues was that what I just talked about was that gap. And should we be adjusting the formula in some way that gives more support to smaller stations? And I remember, the one big CSG, well, they were all big, but the CSG review we had, New York and Boston on, and then we had the small, so you had like John Abbott and Becky McGurr from the smaller stations, and we had a mix of different types. We were pretty intentional about geography, budget size, and all of that. And my goal was to have a report that would come out of that, because each CSG review had a report that went to the board, and you would bring members of that review panel to the board. So on this particular one, it was to have Becky McGurr and John Abbott present the findings. And I do remember one segment there, and I don't know what John Abbott was almost in tears about, but Becky was consoling him. And we were able to come to a consensus. But the real issue was to try to mitigate, put a cap on the NFFS for larger stations, so that it would allow more of that money to flow down to the smaller stations. And it was, I think, a pretty significant effort, the impact potentially for small stations. And we did take that to the board, and the board did approve it, and John actually supported that.
Yes.
I don't know if Neil on the New York side was as supportive, but John was definitely supportive, and I thought did a really good job.
I did too. I remember a meeting, I think it might have been in Nashville, where you and I and John Abbott from GBH and Neil Shapiro from WNET got together and talked all of this through. And I have to give credit to both of those guys. I thought that they understood the situation that had developed over time, where the bigger stations had really been able to do very well, leveraging their CSG and the other things that they had in terms of support. And the smaller stations were kind of falling behind. And, they understood that and were supportive of what you were trying to do with CSG policy.
I would say it's a criticism of our board, so I'll say that benignly. John Abbott also talked at that meeting about the need for the larger stations to take a more proactive role in addressing not just the inequity, but the health of the system. And GBH, as you know, has a lot of resources. And, he was basically kind of putting forward a notion that there should be more help coming within the station community, not just from CPB. And I thought he had talked about it at one of the meetings. I thought he presented it very well at the board meeting. And somehow the board took it as an insult, and they were not supportive at all. And they basically thought John was out of his lane, I guess, and that was CPB's role, not WGBH's. And I remember John was very upset about that, and I was supportive. and I like our board. I liked our board, and I think there was some maybe misunderstanding. But to me, especially if you fast forward to where we are today, I think it was a lost opportunity.
So, Ted, there's another body of work around system technology that you invested a lot of energy in. Can you talk about that?
First of all, I'd say I'm a liberal arts guy, right? So this is always a challenge, when a liberal arts guy meets a bunch of tech nerds and technology and language that it always seems foreign. So yes, we did. This was again looking at the loss of the PTFP program, which I think people know was a program that provided matching funding for equipment purchases, and really was something that stations, big, little, medium size, used over many years. I don't know how long the program had been in existence. Certainly when I was at KBDI, so well over
Yes.
20 years, and was an incredible program. And it really allowed smaller stations to kind of put together the funding needed, especially for the expensive transmitter type, purchases that had to happen. That went away. Um, and so there was no funding around that, and there was a worry, I think, at CPB, or I was concerned that if you look down the road to the shelf life of a lot of these pieces of equipment, how were smaller stations going to meet that challenge? So we did a study with Eagle Hill, John McCoskey, who was at Eagle Hill at the time. Um, it was very thorough. We talked to a lot of engineers in the system, looked at the aging, where they were, what they expected to have to spend over the next 5 years. Um, and the picture that came back was not encouraging. Um, it really looked like there was going to be some potential for stations just not able to meet this. So out of that, we put together an initiative that I guess we call shared purchasing. And the idea was to bring a collaborative together to drive down those prices, to, in a more central way, negotiate with the vendors, and especially again on the larger items, but cameras and whatnot, and to kind of negotiate prices down. There were some different reasons why that didn't work. I think internally there was some definite miscommunications. I think externally we only had one bidder, which was not good. Um, so CPB pulled back the funding for that effort. And it just sort of stumbled along and then died. I think the larger problem, and I don't think that this is a CPB problem, is that we as a system don't act collectively. I mean, we join PBS together, we pay dues, but we are very much often, despite AGC and all of that, we have our own engineering departments. We don't share a lot of things. We get together at these different regional or national meetings, a lot of which is happy talk, but there isn't a serious effort to kind of look at the economics and how we can reduce our infrastructure. So when I look back on it, I just think this was basically, trying to do something in the wind, and it wasn't going to work. But looking forward, I think it's going to have to be something more than this uh, as we're facing the stuff coming up.
Just pick up on what you were saying about the PTFP program. So what that was Public Telecommunications Facilities Program. It was within the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, which was all in the Department of Commerce. And stations could apply for grants for equipment. I know in South Dakota, especially when I was there, we had a lot of NTIA PTFP grants to build the public television, public radio network, and so did stations all over the country. I think it had at the time it wrapped up somewhere in 2011. It had $25 million a year that was in, and good friend of ours, Lynn Chadwick, who worked at CPB, but also worked at PTFP, spent a lot of time working on those grants with stations. So that's what PTFP was.
Well, I remember at KBDI, we were just on the air struggling, and it was a woman, and I wish I could remember her name. She's just wonderful. She just worked with us. We got funding for half-inch tape machines because
Yeah.
that's what we were using at the time. And it didn't fit into their categories. It wasn't, professional enough, but she just figured it out. And so it was one of those, I guess, in some ways, technocratic, bureaucratic entities, but the people there, I remember Walter Shepard as well,
Yes.
going out of his way to figure out how to work constructively with stations. So it's too bad that it's not still around.
Yeah. So Ted, another component of kind of system technology were the JMCs, Joint Master Controls. You talk a little bit about what those were and how that I think was a really good success story in relationship to the system.
Well, I'll talk about it some, Greg, but you're the one I remember spending hours on the phone with folks on this and some of the other programs, way more time than I ever would have done, but I appreciate it greatly. Uh, but this actually was an idea that was around even at KBDI. I actually worked out a deal with KRMA to do a joint master that then was scuttled after I left. But
Mhm.
it's just an expensive infrastructure, and there was funding through CPB to try to encourage. I think Doug Weiss was the original one who might have thought up this program,
Yes.
but to encourage collaboration amongst stations in nearby markets or overlap markets as well, that would reduce cost, personnel, and equipment cost. And so there was a program that CPB had when I was there as well. It continued that you basically, I think, managed.
Mhm.
And I think it still was successful, more so perhaps than the merger program that we'll talk about shortly. But it seemed to me to be one that uh, was a success.
Bottom line is prior to the Joint Master Controls, and there were three of them, prior to that, every station was having to basically have technical operators online all the time playing back tapes. It was a great efficiency, is the way I looked at it.
Yes. Um, and I think it maybe blends into the the program you spent a lot of time in as well was the merger program is
Mhm.
encouraging stations, especially those in multi-station markets, but not always, uh, to look at ways that they might come together. And this was really interesting because it in some places it seemed to work, never seamlessly. I think for all the talk about the economics and why it made sense, probably the biggest hurdle was cultural, or staffing, and people worried about their jobs, or people thinking the other station, the governance and all of that. But you could talk a little bit about this because I think there were some successes and perhaps ones that were more difficult than others.
The thing that I saw when I worked in South Dakota, when I worked in Wisconsin, is that um, you could have stations come together in a merger where it made sense, keep a bureau-like kind of presence in a local community, but end up with a lot of efficiencies that you could then um, put into programming, the resources, rather than just going to all of the things just to keep individual stations alive. You could put back into programming. I knew going into it there would be a lot of pushback or resistance. But if you look back, and I did a report on this with the help of Ted Coltman from CPB. If you go back to the beginning, the start of CPB, a lot of mergers in radio and television have taken place over time. I was astounded by the number of them. We didn't get as many mergers as I thought that we could. It wasn't really anything that I had to do because it was going to happen anyway, but it had taken 20 years in Los Angeles. That was one of the mergers that ended up happening during the time that this program existed. Another one was in Southern Illinois, where the public television stations got together and combined. It also happened in Virginia. So there were some good successes along the way. There were some disappointments too.
I remember we used to have like talks, theoretical talks about how the system ought to be run. I don't know if you want to be on record with any of these, but we we would say, well, why don't we just give a regional CSG grant, or maybe by state, so that stations had to come together. So you would have, a southern region or western region, or maybe it's just some cases this already happens, but and I think the concept, which was never fully thought out, at least on my end, was you would have a lot more economies of scale, and you would be able to better harness resources to deliver better local services.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had another one that was, I think, a pretty good success in West Texas with the public television stations there.
And some just happened. I think NET and LIW happened pretty quickly. That might have been more of a buyout. Um, but yeah, I think, it's a larger issue that we'll come back to maybe as we go through all of our other issues.
Okay. Do you want to say anything about ATSC 3?
I was thinking about that in preparation for this, and what it made me think of is there's always a new technology that's going to change everything. If you go back, at least my time, you go back 40 years, there's always something that's coming along that's either going to kill us or make us like raise a whole lot more money. And digital or multi-channel or different things like that. And I remember ATSC3, a lot of consultants were making a lot of money on how this was going to be a game changer. And maybe it changed, but I missed it. So we did do some work on it, probably hired somebody, but I'd be honest, it's one that kind of has faded, maybe been just kind of, overtaken by this whole digital migration that's happening. So I think maybe we'll touch on it as we go forward, but it's not the salvation of broadcast TV. Let's put it that way.
You convened a group that looked at innovative business practices for stations because the times they were a changing.
Well, that was the idea. I think we had talked about it at different studies, and I just thought it'd be interesting to get a group together, some new managers, some others who had a certain reputation for kind of bucking the trends. So I had, people like, I think, Courtney Pledger, who was new to Arkansas, Wanya Lucas, fairly new in Atlanta, Kevin Martin, relatively new, he'd been around a while, but in Cleveland, and then, Steve Bass, Rob Dunlap, and some other ones. And the idea was not to get into major theories about where we were going. It was more to kind of look at what could be done on the, experiment or try some things. So it wasn't around a long time, but the project we took on which I think was one maybe ahead of its time, but certainly more relevant now, was just creation of short video. This was the beginning of content migrating to different platforms. And the thinking was that those platforms were better suited to 2-3 minute pieces.
So this is what we're doing, 2 to 7 minute program. We'll work with mentors if people want to be or need mentoring or need expertise, production expertise or whatever around the group. They've agreed, some of the larger stations, to provide it. We're putting a timeline. We haven't said go yet, so we haven't started yet, but it's basically a 6-week timeline. It's open to others, so frankly, all it means is you gotta do it. You can't just show up and talk. But if you're willing to kind of come into this particular project, we're happy to bring people into it. We're going to review and then share the results and replicate.
Led to a lot of interesting breakthroughs. I mean, one year partnered with, so you had Atlanta partnering with Cleveland on a business kind of, business 2-minute clips about business in Cleveland, business stories in Atlanta. The one I remember the most is, again, kind of seems obvious today, but back then was not. Courtney showed a 2-minute video. It's a wonderful piece about a farmer in rural Arkansas. It had been shot by an intern on his free time. He went out with his iPhone and shot this video, and it was a great piece of work. And if you look at the world today, and we were talking earlier about the cost of equipment and loss of PTFP, but the real challenge, I think, is the lack of creativity on a local level. That the level of production is too often, not in every case by any means, but it is too often at kind of a static level, and there isn't enough resource put into it. There was the study done by Harsager a number of years ago, I think, that basically said, put your money into national production, and that's where you're going to generate revenue. And he was right at the time. But there was an area there that we were exploring that was, how do you do local? How do you do it well? How do you do it in a way that can be competitive in the digital age? So I love working with a group. We didn't have any great goal in mind, but it was one of those projects that I've always felt good about.
Times have changed. We need to be faster. We need to be more creative with our programming. And I think there were some really good pieces that came out of that.
Yeah, well, it needs to be more of a priority, and you've got to fund it. And I think that's one that happens at a local level. It's moving away from your dependence on PBS or even NPR. And I don't think I'm not aware, I may have missed. I don't think that's happening on the scale it needs to happen.
You did some preliminary work on a rural initiative for public television.
Part of this broader vision, as I'm hearing it from this group, we want to up the visibility of rural America. We want to do that by building on what strengths that we already have, which I believe, this group exemplifies.
It was inspired by an OSPI meeting, actually, and OSPI was the one affinity group I didn't know when I came to CPB, so I had made an effort to go to their annual meetings and got beyond the stereotype of the dull state licensee and really got to like the folks. And I went to a meeting where there was a lot of talk around covering rural, because a lot of state licensees are covering a whole state, and the state includes a lot of rural, especially in the South and the West. And we were just talking a lot about can that be encouraged, because it's not really reflected in the PBS schedule on a regular basis. There's a lot of good stories, a lot of interesting stories, and there are production folks at these different stations that are capable of doing that kind of work. So it was really inspired by that to put together a meeting at CPB just to talk about rural. And frankly, if you think about what's going on in some of the politics today, I think this, in hindsight, was a really important initiative. So we had a great meeting, and I did not stay involved in it. It was coordinated by another person, and it basically became a one-off. I think we gave some funding. I'm not sure how that progressed, but the vision was to have a lot more of an intentional kind of funding for this effort, to have support, say, for a Western coalition or a Southern coalition, or even thematically around different issues that might be happening in rural communities, and to really do that on more of an ongoing basis. And so I think it's still an area that should be looked at a lot more seriously. But it was inspiring, I would say, to hear folks talking about it who felt very strongly about, one, the lack of it in our system, and also their kind of inspiration for doing more. They're like, I was going to write a memoir called My Greatest Failures. That's a lot of times they're like these things that is say, we should have done this, we should have done this, and or we tried it but it didn't work, like shared purchasing. And but you learn a lot from those things. And so it's not that I'm looking back with regret. It's just you kind of see where things didn't flow the way that maybe they could have.
Yeah, but you're right. You learn a lot that you can apply to another experience when something doesn't quite go the way that you envisioned it in the first place. I want to move to now something that CPB collectively, all of the people at CPB get heavily involved in, and that happens to be national conferences. One of the things about Pat Harrison is that she puts so much effort into each and every speech.
Our harassment prevention training, which every CPB employee is required to take. We and society are working to address this issue, not just for specific cases, but for long-term, sustainable, and enduring change.
You did some innovative things with conferences.
Well, first, I agree with you on Pat. She's extraordinary, and not just her preparation, but her ability off the cuff to be totally spontaneous. And I think it's one of her great strengths. So we, our department especially, had a lot to do with the PMBA conference, because we did a lot of the business analysis, tracking how different the trends and stations and revenue and expenditures and all of that. And Mustafa, who was great in our department, spent hours kind of putting those reports together. So we would go to PMBA in force. We had a good number of people from our department that were there. So there were two different meetings that I was involved in. I'll talk about first doing that report on the financial status of the system. And Mustafa and I would do them. It was like a two-person show, and Mustafa would just get totally into the numbers of how different quadrants were doing and what was up, what was down.
Funding for corporation, which includes foundation and businesses, is up also. You have a 25% increase for foundation.
And my role was much more to kind of ground this in the reality of the people that were there. So what is your experience? You're a smaller station. Did your revenue go down or up? Or what are you facing? What are your challenges? So I can't speak to how they were before, but it was a very granular. There is something about the business part of the system. I spend a lot of time in meetings with managers, and there is a kind of a pattern or a way that people talk to each other. And it's a little bit salesy, a little bit, I've got this, I'm in charge. Business managers or business department folks are different and tend to be a little more, grounded in numbers, I guess. So that was a great experience for me.
The first time, Ted, you did this, let's say I was a skeptic. I thought, what is Ted doing? And it turned out to be a huge success.
We had a session we started, I think it was the first year, all I remember, first of all, is the room was set up where all the chairs, the typical conference are facing forward, and then you've got somebody supposedly on the stage, the wise person. And I just remember walking into that room and saying, this is not going to work for what we're trying to do. So we, literally 5 minutes before the meeting, rearranged the whole room so it was in a circle. I think it was about like Ask CPB or something like that.
Yeah.
And so rather than have CPB wise people up there telling about how great we were and what we were doing, we just turned it into an open discussion about what's on your mind. Do you have issues? Do you have questions about CPB? But we're not going to give you any stump speeches. It's just an open conversation. And I think the first one, we wasn't quite sure. I didn't know the group particularly well, and so I didn't know, this all really depends on who's there and whether they're willing to speak up. And they were willing to speak up.
Yes, they were. Which was one of the things about it, Ted. This session occurred. I think it might have been the last session of the conference. And thing about the business managers is they all had really good, tough questions. So I'm wanting to get out of town. And here, you were, drawing people out with, tough questions that we would need to answer, but it became more of a conversation, I guess, and I think that maybe was what was a success about it. I learned a lot of things. I think we applied some of the learning that we got from those conversations. It was a huge success.
What was also good about it is our chief legal officer, West Smithers, and our chief finance officer, Bill Taman, were there. And they go to all the meetings, but they're typically in the background and very quiet. And in this session, they were called on. I mean, and I don't mean it in a bad way. I mean, but there were questions that had to do with their areas, and it was good to see Bill Taman. He did it well, but to kind of be answering and being part of a group and discussing what the finance issues were and stuff. And so it was a different side of CPB for folks to see. And I do think it became, because we did it, I don't know, we did it every year.
Yes.
Became the best attended session.
Yes. It was a really good success. But you also had some success with other conferences, the PBS Tech Conference, the GM Strategy meeting.
Well, I staying with the PMBA and then moving into the tech, because I mentioned that what was nice about it, they were voices you don't normally hear. They were managers, but they weren't the general managers or the presidents, but they were key people. The tech conference was similar. They were the engineers, and they have a different way of talking. Both them and the business people have a different way of talking than the GMs have. And, it takes a little getting used to. It tends to be more grounded and not afraid of like saying things that may sound weird at the time. So it was, that was those two were my favorite meetings to go to because they felt more open and more honest. I mean, people were talking about, real issues at their station, very granular cases, equipment or challenges with staffing, especially on the engineering, the broadcast side, finding, engineers in today's world, where to look for them. And so that would be one. I mean, it was in Las Vegas, the tech conference, and it took me a couple of years before I adjusted and even got to like Las Vegas. But typically I think Caesar's Palace or something, and you'd be walking through these kind of glassy-eyed gamblers up in machines and everything, walking into a conference room with engineers. And I think both those sessions I think were good for CPB to be at. And I found it personally it was kind of enlivening to go to, I would say. The GM strategy meeting I didn't. Once I got to CPB, I don't think I facilitated the larger meetings because I was a biased person at that point, a CPB person. But we worked closely with the folks at PBS. So we basically coordinated the meetings. And that generally went pretty well. I think there were moments
Mhm.
where there was some tension around what issues and things like that. But we would agree on who would be the moderators and what the sessions were and who was going to speak where. And so less of an active facilitating role, but we were trying to make those meetings, and I don't know how successful, to be honest. I think it's one of those challenges in our system is to actually have the hard conversations. But the goal was always, how do you structure this to actually get beyond the happy talk? And I think sometimes we did better than others.
Yeah, I think the thing about it though is that you maybe something won't happen, 3 months, 6 months later, but the point is you've had the conversation and things come back even years later that the GM strategy meeting helped to spur ideas that then take shape. So it might not, it was such a futuristic kind of conversation that things might not have happened real quickly, but had long-term impact.
Yeah, I think that's probably true going back to Spectrum. And remember, we were talking about this earlier, Tim Fallon in Pennsylvania.
Yes,
He's always
yes.
pushing on how much leeway he would have with giving up Spectrum or renting out Spectrum, and he was really trying to find the absolute edge and still keep his community service grant funding. When you look back at it, what he was doing was pushing where I think as a system we are increasingly getting to, where it's going to be a lot of different things that happen with that spectrum and how that plays out. And especially if there's another auction or another sales, it's going to be pretty significant.
Yeah, I agree. Tim, while he pushed the envelope, he did so in a really good way that made us spend a lot of time at the whiteboard, trying to figure out, is this, something that fits within policy? So tip of the hat to Tim on that. Ted, as we kind of maybe start to wrap up, prior to coming to CPB, you spent a year at PBS working on the public media models of the future. Would you address what you see in the future for public media and how your models of the future might work to help the system going forward?
Boy, that's a big question, Greg. And I will jump in, but feel free to interrupt me if I start to wander. I may start off by wandering. I think on one level, there was a project I remember doing, and it was one of the better strategic planning initiatives I was involved with. I think it was Larry Wilkinson. It was a CPB thing a number of years ago, and it was scenario planning. So rather than say, I know what the future is, what you would say, we want to lay out 4 possible scenarios. And then we want to look at each scenario and say, what do we do in that scenario? And I think that's something the system desperately needs to do at this point. There is a scenario that is a very likely one that is not good. I mean, essentially, we know, depending upon the election in November, federal funding could be deeply threatened. Okay. So what happens in that scenario? What happens if that funding goes away or is significantly reduced? Very, very real, 50% chance that that will happen. We also know, and even by PBS's records, that the broadcast audience is declining. And even the over 60 audience, which is now the main audience on broadcast television, is declining. That we're moving into an age where broadcast is not the primary means. We already are there to some degree, but it will get more so. So what do you do if your birthright, your transmitter is the reason that you are in your community because your ability to reach a lot of people at once is suddenly not the major attribute it was. It may not even be worth maintaining at some point. So what do you do with that? And then looking at the disaggregation of the audiences, the loss of the PBS as the primary driver of content is, if you're local, what is that? What is your role? And it could be a very different scenario. It could be one where stations are operating on way less money than they used to have. It could be one in which they have to develop a lot more strength around what they're doing locally. And that isn't necessarily about buying equipment. It's about who are the people that are creating the content that people are going to want to watch. And so you have this kind of, I'm calling it a worst case, but it's not. But built into that, there are some degrees of that that are going to happen. So the future, the report I did was not foreseeing any of this particularly, but it did have some elements that I think are the key elements. And essentially is you need an economic base. I mean, I think it was Beth Curley in Nashville who coined the phrase, no money, no mission. If you don't have some kind of resources, you're not going to be able to operate. You also have to have a social value. Why are you there? I mean, is it education? Is it, news and content? Is it entertainment? What is why does your community value you? You've got to be clear. That's your value proposition. And then the organization, you've got to have the right people. It's the old Jim Collins thing. You got to have the right people in the right place. If you don't have that, it doesn't have to be the largest staff in the world, but you need to have people who are creative and people who are attuned to the community and can tap into that. So those are the three elements. And then, within that, it's finding your niche. And that niche may not be the same. I mean, there are some who believe that there is a strong educational service still to do. I've had this talk with folks at CPB, and I know Eric Hipper Nita has also talked about this. I'm not against it at all. I just don't understand it at this point, where that service is. But there is certainly a need to reach kids, many of whom are not going to school as regularly, many of whom don't have access to the kinds of content they need to. So there is certainly a need. The question is, how would you meet it? I think the news, Steve Bass in Oregon is a great kind of advocate of the local news and coverage. That takes a tremendous effort. You got to be out there in the community. You've got to have reporters who know what they're doing. So there are things that can happen, and you've got to look at content. The content becomes more important than the distribution. You've got to have content that people want to see. Then you got to figure out, where are they watching? Are they watching on their iPhones? Are they watching on their laptops? Are they watching on their big TV in the living room? And what is it that the content needs to be? How is it formed to reach them? So it's a hard world, and it's a world that, frankly, local stations, by and large, have not had to grapple with, because they've had the PBS national feed, or even on the radio side, the NPR feed, and they haven't had to really worry about it. If you look at where the money comes from, it comes from the pledge drives, the major programs. It doesn't come from the local. So to change that dynamic is not going to be easy, but that's a transition that needs to be happening now while you still have the resources to do it. I know Steve Bass wrote a letter. I don't know, some people have seen it, but he basically cited how NPR News works with having the inserts for a local, and that NewsHour should have done that. And NewsHour actually tried it, and I know they didn't try it because Jim Lehrer said, "Over my dead body." But stations were also not particularly in favor of it either, because they didn't think they could match the quality and they didn't have the resources. So I'm giving you a long answer, but essentially, without going into the whole models, because the models just cites examples. I mean, it lays out different areas where people can be, where stations have chosen. San Diego had chosen news. Nashville had chosen funded documentaries around issues of concern in Nashville. you had in Minnesota where they did the not-for-profit channel. There are different ways that this is executed, but you've got to start by looking at your own community. So that's my abbreviated answer that was probably too long.
No, I think it was. Actually very good and very concise, Ted. I want to ask a final question, maybe a series of questions, but I'll take them one at a time. And the first one comes from something that I read in your Public Media Models of the Future paper. It's on page 30, and it's where the Twin Cities Public Television's editorial guidelines for their Minnesota channel were listed. And the very first thing in the editorial guidelines was never mislead our audience. And I started to think about that because I really couldn't see a time when I thought we had misled our audience in general. But I thought about it, and it prompts this question. As you reflect on your years in public media, have we done right by the audiences that we sought to serve?
I think overall, maybe that we have done right. I think the key part there is the audiences we have sought to serve. If you look at where our audiences are, they're typically older and typically better educated. I think we have not, obviously it's not true across the board. But I think in terms of being really in our communities and serving those communities, that we've probably tilted toward where the funding is more so, and where we could get the grants or where we might be able to pledge. Sometimes they meld together, but I'm not at all embarrassed by what public media has done over the years. I think it's done some great stuff. And so I think it's had to kind of look for a resource where it could find them. So no, I think I'm proud to have been part of that effort in different ways over the years. My concern is going forward, and you mentioned the funding, because this came up also with Melanie when she was talking on Penn State. We're going into an era where the FCC guidelines often don't apply because it's not broadcast. And I think the new model for funding is requiring a greater sense of editorial guidelines than ever before, where you might be looking at some commercialization or looking at working with a funder that has a role. And the key is, how do you maintain that editorial separation as you go forward? Because it's not the same. It's not going to be as clear cut about non-commercial and commercial. But yes, I think we're entering a different world where a lot of the old rules don't apply. And I could miss the old world, I guess. I miss the days of Walter Cronkite and McNeil Lair.
One of the things that I think about quite often is, did I work in the golden age of public media? But I'm optimistic for the future. But what is it going to take for the next generation of managers and employees working together to be successful with their audiences of the future?
Well, I think we talked about that a little bit. I think the challenge is what's gonna motivate that change. And on the one hand, goes back to scenarios. The most likely scenario is going to be a crisis, whether we like it or not. There's some kind of crisis, loss of federal funding, spectrum being either taken away or put up to the highest bidder across the board. They have complete loss of broadcasting as a viable medium. Those are all, crises that are going to undercut the whole basis of public television. So, the question is, and we've been asking this for a while, I mean, what does it take to change when you know it's going to happen, but it hasn't happened quite yet. So stations are still getting by on their conventional fundraising. And this is the time, and I forget which business guru, but essentially that the key to changing is to do it when you have the resources. So you have the resources from your old business that are funding your ability to change to the next. When you don't have those anymore, you're not going to have the capacity to change. So innovation is really looking at things before that significant change happens. I think Netflix was probably the obvious great example. I remember, getting all these things in the mail, DVDs, and it felt like almost overnight. It wasn't quite overnight, but they changed. They saw it was coming and they changed their business model. I think this has to happen in public media. The challenge that we talked about, again, I don't want to be negative about it. We don't have the structure and the system for change. We don't have, like the BBC has one person in charge that can cause change to happen. We have all these separate licensees. You've got 3 national organizations with different modes of kind of influence. But there is no way to say, well, we're now going to go down this avenue. So that has to change, I believe. There has to be, and might start with a cohort, some small cohort of managers taking that lead, but something has to change in that effect. And I'm afraid that the national organizations are their ROIs and the reasons they're there sort of paralyzed them in a way. I mean, they're doing good work within those tunnels, I guess, but what has to happen is outside of them. So I don't know. I'm not trying not to be pessimistic because I actually think there's a very dynamic potential future that has a great more localism combined with a kind of national collective. But I don't know. I can't predict exactly how that's going to happen.
Getting a business model for the digital world is something that has, I think, eluded us so far.
Yes, and it's probably eluded a lot of people, eluded commercial folks, and but if you look at the big commercial folks and you see what they're doing, how they're hedging their bets and moving things around and creating their alternate channels, there's probably something to learn from that. But I would love to have a clearer answer. But it would
So,
give a false sense of security to me and you.
any final comments?
No, I really appreciate your work, David's work. It's been a fascinating journey to kind of intentionally look back. I think the only insight I had somewhere along the line, and I would not have thought of this, I don't think, until going through this process. In some way, when we look to the future, there may be more to learn from KBDI than from any other place I've been, because you had a smaller station struggling, trying to figure out its own identity in a community without having the obvious support of the national program service or the typical audience. And it wasn't that it was a major success, but that struggle and trying to figure that out may become more commonplace looking in the future, that ability to kind of say, what do we do now?